My daughter-in-law called me useless at Christmas, and 40 people laughed. Her voice was lacquered in red silk, a laugh that hit the table like dropped cutlery. The chandelier threw 1,000 tiny lights across Vanessa's dress. The table groaned under tamales, platters of bacalao, steaming cups of ponche that smelled of cinnamon and orange peel. The house was full, my house, full of cousins, neighbors, old friends from Coyoacan, and the children I had raised with my own 2 hands. They had all come because that is what we did. We ate, we argued over politics, we compared recipes, we pretended the family was as smooth and polished as the silverware. For a moment the room bent toward that pretending. Then Vanessa tilted it all on its head with 3 words. "You're useless, Amelia." It was aimed like a splinter, precise and meant to lodge. Laughter followed, thin and automatic, the kind of laughter people use when they don't know how to be cruel and polite at the same time. My grandson, Lucia, was standing at the sink when it happened, looked up with something like shock on her face. My son Rodrigo's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Patricia, my daughter, had that look of someone who wants to make it better but cannot find the words. For a few heartbeats, the world narrowed to Vanessa's red dress and a sound that felt like a falling cupcake. I set down my cup of ponche. The kitchen smelled like citrus and cinnamon, and a life I had carved out of small, stubborn choices. Overtime shifts in textile factories, rooms rented for a few pesos, afternoons bargaining at the mercado. I had held those smells in my body for decades. I knew what they meant. I also knew who I was, and I knew that if I let one laugh change me, it would be the last time I would recognize the woman looking back in the mirror. So I did what I always did when the world threatened to rearrange me for someone else's comfort. I breathed in, slow, and did nothing obvious. Not because I was afraid, though there was fear, but because the thing that had kept me alive through a childhood in Oaxaca and a widowhood in the city that did not care was this: patience, observation, and a stubborn refusal to make myself smaller for anyone's amusement. My hand brushed my purse where the remote lived, small and almost invisible. I did not yet press it. I let the laughter wash over the room and die. The moment hummed like a held breath. In the corner, my old radio, where Joanna liked to leave the news on low, Mumbles sang a Christmas tune I had heard for 30 years. Vanessa's face unfolded with triumph, an athlete at the end of a race that was not hers. "You're useless," she repeated, as if the second time would make the joke sharper. "You don't even know how to manage money. We all know it." 40 faces, 40 glances, a dozen frowns, a dozen polite smiles, the rest somewhere between complicity and curiosity. I felt all of them.
I felt them like the wind that passes through the curtains on a hot afternoon, carrying with it the scent of other people's decisions. Then I pressed the remote. The television at the other end of the room flickered, static for a beat, like a throat clearing. Then the screen filled with a small, grainy image of Vanessa and Rodrigo in our hallway, caught by a camera I had insisted on months before, just in case. The laughter pitched down into something that sounded like a distant train. Someone said, "What's that?" More shouts, a chair scraped. The sound of the room collapsed into the flat, steady voice of a recorded conversation. For the first time that night, the room went silent in a way silence is meant to be, full of attention, not absence. I could tell you now everything that happened after that: the videos, the notary, the lawyer, the frozen transfers, the ugly, necessary legal language, but this is not the place to rush through the reveal. The thing that matters first is to explain how I got there, why I had hidden cameras in my house at all, why I had kept paperwork in a box under the sink, why I had a notary who would come on a whisper, and a granddaughter who loved me enough to become my co-conspirator. If you are still with me, I promise the rest will come. If this grabbed you, if the idea of a woman defending what is hers matters, please subscribe so you won't miss the rest. 6 months earlier, I would not have imagined myself as someone who plotted anything. I was 68 then, a number that people treat like a label, as if age explains your whole life. I remember the day I first thought of owning property not as a dream, but as a plan. I was 22, my hands raw from work in a textile mill in Oaxaca, and I told myself I would not be someone other people could move around like furniture. That was the first contract I signed with myself, to be a woman who could stand on her own possessions the way other people stand on 2 feet. I came to Mexico City with 2 changes of clothes and a small suitcase with a photograph of my mother tucked into a hidden pocket. Coyoacan was then, and remained for a long time, a patchwork of markets and old houses where vendors still sold tamales wrapped in banana leaves. The city demanded sweat in exchange for rent, and I gave it. I worked piecing together fabric for suits, washing clothes at night, mending shoes for neighbors. I learned where to find bamboo sticks for the garden, where the women who made mole took out their spices, which buses didn't bother asking for change. I made friends, Joanna and Mercedes, women who would later become like veins of the household, steady, warm, willing to trade a meal for a favor. I married young, briefly. The man I married wanted a son and a quiet life. We had Rodrigo and then Patricia, and the rest is a private story of hard nights and harder mornings. My husband died when the children were small.
Widowhood taught me the truth about loneliness and the practicalities of survival. I sold the small furniture we had, took a second job, learned not to wear my grief like a public thing. Little by little, through savings, through being careful when the neighbors wanted to borrow money without returning it, through investing in rooms for rent in a place in Coyoacan, I began to own little pieces of the world. Owning things does something to you. It does not make you proud in the loud way people think. It makes you careful. It makes you aware that objects are both shelter and safety. I kept a list, always on a little notebook with a tattered cover, of the properties and rents and the names of those who paid on time. I kept deeds in a wooden box under the sink, wrapped in a plastic bag so they would not be eaten by moisture. I did not tell everyone. I told only myself. That secrecy was simple. I wanted to see who loved me for my cooking, my stories, my morning walks, who loved me because I was me, not because my name opened doors. Rodrigo was my pride and my puzzle. As a boy, he was full of stories. He would walk to the papelera and come back with a new adventure. As a man, he was soft-faced and easily led. He loved his wife. Of that there could be no doubt. But love can tangle with the wind, and sometimes you do not see the wind until it has rearranged the curtains. Vanessa arrived like a season too early. She was from a well-dressed neighborhood, her hands always manicured, hair arranged as if air were a styling product. When she first came to our house for dinner, she laughed at my stories of Oaxaca with peels that were too precise. She stayed late, helping me wash dishes, asking questions, not in the way a curious daughter-in-law asks, but in the way of a surveyor. She took note of frames on walls, of small furniture bought at markets, of the wooden box under the sink with curious, almost idle glances. "Where do you keep your papers, Amelita?" she asked once, plucking at a linen napkin with nails like tiny made swords. "In the box under the sink," I said, and I thought she would forget. People forget. That is part of being human. But she did not forget. The early red flags were small and almost reasonable. She redecorated a spare bedroom without asking, moving a bookshelf I had loved since I was 30. She paid for a wedding we could not afford. She said it was a surprise. Rodrigo thanked her then like someone thanking the weather. After the wedding, the first small loans began. "Can I borrow for a new car?" Rodrigo asked one Sunday after Mass, his voice softer than the question. I gave him money for my envelope. It was the same envelope I had used to pay rent, but I thought of it as a father's need. I gave. I loved my children the way the river loves the stones it carries, persistent and deep. The loans increased. Vanessa suggested a joint account for the family. The phrase felt like a net being cast over the night.
She asked about powers of attorney for convenience. "When you travel, Mama," Rodrigo said, smiling, little legal talismans that made their way into our conversations like guests who never left. She was always near the paperwork, always offering to help with forms and summons. Once she complimented the box under the sink and asked casually if there was anything important in it. That night, my stomach turned. I locked the box and moved the deeds into a different place, this time not telling anyone. Patricia saw it first, her face a slow curve of doubt. "They are spending a lot," she said. "They are always buying things." She watched her brother change the way someone watches a beloved painting when a new crack appears. "Maybe it's normal," she would add to soothe herself. "Families soothe themselves like that. It's how we get through the days." Vanessa was good at the gentle push,
redecorating, offering, volunteering, but she was also good at the small cuts. She undermined on a level that looked like concern. "Mama, are you sure you remember your addresses?" she would say in front of guests, voice light as a flauta. "Have you ever thought about a manager? People forget things sometimes when they get older." Spouses murmured sympathies. Cousins nodded. Nobody wanted to be the one to cross her. Gaslighting is a slow liquid that dilutes the shape of a person over time. It makes you doubt your keys, your memory, your worth. I will not dramatize it here. I will not claim illnesses that were not said. But Vanessa's tactics were simple and cruel. Small erasers, jokes at my expense, a constant suggestion that the house, the money, the documents, things I had acquired by ripping up my knuckles and counting pennies, did not really belong to me because I was not up to managing them. I did not scream. I had learned early that loudness makes people think you are hysterical. I watched. I recorded events in my head like a friend takes notes. Lucia, my granddaughter, then 23, studying social work at UNAM, saw me watching and asked one afternoon as we shelled peas on the patio, "Are you okay, Abuela?" Her voice did something to me, raw, honest. She had the practical intuition of youth and the moral backbone of someone who had seen injustice in internship placements and community centers. "It is nothing," I said, because adults say that, but I knew I needed help. I also knew that asking for help was not the same as giving up, so I asked Lucia to be my eyes in small ways. Hold on to letters, come by for tea, notice who came in and out of the house. She did more than notice. She came back the next week with a look like she had swallowed smoke. "Have you thought of getting help?" she asked. "Legally, I mean." We spoke with caution. The world rewards people who handle problems like a scandalous soup, loud, quick, messy. I needed calm.
I called Don Julian Mendoza, the notary I had used the day I signed for the small room on 4th Street, the man who smelled like old paper and honest ink. "Don Julian," I said, "I think I need to see my records again, just for myself." There are people like Don Julian in the world, older men who have seen many families pass through their office, who step into a room like a neutral priest. He came over one morning, not with fanfare, but with a small briefcase and a face that listened like a scale. We did not speak about cameras the first time. We spoke about papers, about a few odd transfers, and about the importance of having deeds in order. He looked at my wooden box with a kind of benevolent disapproval. "You have been careful, Amelia," he said. "There's nothing wrong with that." That word, careful, was the best compliment anyone could give me. I had not done this for pride. I had done it because the world is full of people who, given enough charm and time, will try to make themselves the center of someone else's life. I had seen it in my own mother. I had seen it in the way relatives would circle a person with a pension in their pocket. So I planned. Planning in old age is not dramatic. It is folding a shirt the same way you have always folded it, counting your change twice, setting aside one meal at a time. But planning for a confrontation, legal, public, and inevitable, was different. It meant thinking about what would shame people, and what would move those same faces from laughter to silence. It meant arguing that dignity was not a private thing you hid under a shawl, but a public posture you carried like a lantern. I told Lucia I wanted to keep my things private, to see who would stand by me when the world turned difficult. "That's cold," she said, fingers in the peas, and then she laughed. "It's a game, Abuela." "It's not a game," I said. "It is a test of what people will do when they think no one is looking." She agreed to help, and then slowly, reverently, without the theatricality of television dramas, we gathered evidence. We did not make a show of it. We did not set a trap that would ask anyone to do something illegal. We installed small, discreet devices with the purpose of protecting me and documenting behavior that had already been suspicious. I will not tell you where we put them or how. There is no glory in instructions. There is only prudence in the fact that they were in rooms where conversations happened and in places where papers passed hands. For 6 months, the house hummed with the ordinary noises of life, and underneath it, the quiet recording of truths. The recordings were tedious at first, tea clinks, television chatter, the laundry machine doing its rounds. But patterns emerge in tedium like a hidden vein in stone. We watched smaller things than bigger. Vanessa riffling through a desk, a folded piece of paper pulled from an envelope, a whispered conversation in the hallway.
Vanessa's voice, sharp and confident,
offering convenience and help in the same breath as she suggested transfers and powers of attorney. Rodrigo's voice, softer, sometimes bewildered, sometimes consenting. I watched them become more comfortable, like actors who had found the familiar cadence of a role. We labeled the files the way a patient person labels a garden harvest: date, location, short note. The records were not dramatic at first. They were evidence, the slow accumulation of proof that someone had been rearranging the furniture of a life. Recording: April 04, indefinido, living room. Vanessa and Rodrigo discuss simplifying finances. Vanessa says, "If Amelia signs the power of attorney, we can make everything easier. She won't have to worry." Rodrigo replies, "See, but do we need to—" Vanessa cuts him off. "We can handle it, mijo." Recording: May 18th, 3:40 p.m. Study: Vanessa riffling through envelope. "Where do you keep your papers, Amelita?" Vanessa asks, mimicking my voice. She laughs. "You must be choking." A soft chuckle off screen, then Rodrigo's voice. "I will sort it this weekend." Those little moments mattered because they showed pattern and intent. Intent is the thing the law often needs to see. It is not enough to show that a deed moved. You must show that people meant for it to move. Juana and Mercedes, who had been with me for nearly 15 years between them, were both witnesses to small changes. Juana found her purse moved one morning. Mercedes noticed the little notary stamps on envelopes that had not been there before. They were loyal not because I paid them twice the salary, a little loan on my part, but because loyalty grows in the small kindnesses of long shared meals and sick days tended. Loyalty is not cheap. When the pattern crystallized, I asked Don Julian for one more favor. He is a man who knows the legal weight of phrases and the sharpness of notary seals. He came to the house again, looked over the recordings, and did not gasp or make a melodramatic pronouncement. Instead, he said plainly, "We can protect what is yours. There are legal steps that are direct and clean." His phrase, "clean," was essential to me. We would not stoop. We would not conduct a melodrama. We would be precise and methodical. Lawyer Morales entered the picture as a professional with a temper like a measured kettle. He reviewed the chain of events. He explained, in language that was clear and not theatrical, what could be done. Requests for injunctions, the possibility of freezing transfers if we could demonstrate imminent harm, filing a criminal complaint if there was evidence of fraud. The legal words are not interesting in themselves, but they possess a bluntness that calmed me. There are parts of the world where poets and priests speak in euphemisms. Law does not like metaphors. It takes evidence and turns it into protection.
"This is exactly why we record," Morales said, watching a clip where Vanessa suggested forging a signature. The camera caught the phrase, "If we have to, we can always sign this later so it looks right." He looked at me. "With enough, we can present a clear case." I think at first some of my family thought I had taken a flair for drama. "Abuela," Patricia had said one afternoon, "is it really necessary to make a thing out of it?" She loved peace in the way people love a favorite sweater. But the thing about peace is that it often comes at the price of your own agency. Lucia and I began to put together a narrative. The house, the receipts, the moment-by-moment recordings, Juana and Mercedes' statements, Don Julian's notes, and small bank documents that showed odd withdrawals. We never invented anything. We only asked questions of the evidence. The arc in our heads felt inevitable. You gather proof, you ask your trusted professionals to act, you present truth in a way that requires no melodrama, only facing. As the months went by, Vanessa grew bolder. She began to speak of changes in a way that revealed the map she had in her hands. The house would be nicer with a manager, she would say in front of guests, almost as a joke. She moved furniture into strange positions during parties, and later claimed it had always been that way. She left notes of helpful suggestions on my table that were actually blueprints of control. Rodrigo, who had always been gentle and impressionable, sometimes surprised me. There were moments when his voice hardened in private, small confessions about debts I did not know he had. But for the most part, he was a man who followed the gravity of whoever spoke to him with the most confidence. Vanessa had that gravity. She had style and insistence and a way of making others perform around her. We did not want to humiliate anyone. That was not the point.
The point was to protect what I had earned, so that my grandchildren might not inherit a life where the air smelled suspicious. The point was to make sure that when people gathered again in my home, the table would be set without the shadow of someone else's design. That plan required patience and the kind of careful accumulation that had sustained me my whole life. By November, our file was thick. We had labeled recordings, made typed transcripts, clean, factual lines that even a tired judge could read, and we had Don Julian's corroboration that the deeds under my sink were indeed in order, and that any attempt to present falsified transfers would be suspicious. We kept copies in multiple places, because prudence had taught me to be redundant. There were nights I lay awake, thinking of the wedding where Vanessa had first smiled so brightly, and Rodrigo held both her hands like a man grateful for a life finally smoothed. I thought of the children I had raised, of how love can be complicated, and I felt a tenderness for Rodrigo, even when I felt betrayed.
It was not my instinct to destroy. It was my instinct to protect. One evening near the end of November, Lucia and I sat at the dining table with the recordings spread out like a constellation we were trying to map. We argued about the smallest things, where to place an excerpt, how much to show. We were not aiming to ruin a life for the sake of spectacle. We were compiling a factual story. "We have enough to show intent," Lucia said, voice tired but steady. "We need to be judicious." "Judicious," I repeated. The word felt like a spoonful of soup. We ate in silence for a long time, then poured ourselves more ponche. Outside the window, a neighbor was setting up papel picado for an early posada. The city continued its ordinary celebrations with the unruffled grace of people who have not yet had the skeletons of their lives exposed. I began to think of the final act as a necessity. There is a time when discretion becomes complicity. I had lived enough not to mistake moral courage for performance. I wanted the truth. I wanted the house to be a house again, not a chessboard. We rehearsed nothing. Rehearsal is for actors. We were not acting. We were assembling truth into a clean, compact presentation. A few key recordings arranged so that the pattern spoke for itself. A notary ready with a public statement. A lawyer with an injunction in hand. We wanted a moment where the laughter would be replaced by attention, where those 40 faces would be asked to witness what had been done in the shadow of their politeness. And so we chose a night when the house would be full by design, Christmas Eve, a gathering that tasted of tamales and rosca and long conversations that sometimes ended in reconciliations or new arguments. It seemed both cruel and fitting to choose that night. Family gathers to reveal the layers of itself. Family also gathers to test loyalty. I did not choose the night to cause maximum scandal. I chose it because it was a night when the truth would have to be heard. As December crept close, Vanessa's movements grew bolder, things left in places, unexpected phone calls, an irritability that small people wear when they fear exposure. I felt the house shift under me like the skin of a sleeping animal. I did not in those days practice anger. I practiced presence, being in the kitchen while people argued in the living room, answering the door when there was a knock, knitting in the parlor while the recordings accumulated like a slow, patient drumbeat. There were small human moments that made the plot thicker. Rodrigo bringing home flowers one afternoon with a nervous apology for a bill he had incurred. Vanessa whispering about taking care of things when my back was turned. Patricia's silent, wet-eyed breakfasts where she read the messages she did not know how to send me. These were the raw textures of a life being rearranged.
I collected these textures like a seamstress keeps scraps because they might be useful and because they were honest. In the last week before Christmas, we met with Don Julian and lawyer Morales in the study. We did not meet in crisis, we met in preparation. The lawyer looked at the file and nodded. "You have a clear narrative," he said. "With the notary's statement and witness accounts, we can seek provisional measures if necessary." He used the word provisional like a shield that kept its historical duty intact. That was crucial to me. We were not seeking vengeance. We were seeking the quiet enforcement of what was right. My will had been a private, ever-evolving thing. Older people change wills like we change sweaters. I had always known, in the quiet rooms at night, how I wanted things distributed. But as the house had been threatened, my intentions felt urgent. I wrote, again and again, who should receive what, not out of hatred for anyone, but out of a desire to make trust and loyalty the currency of my final choices. The will I drafted the day after our meeting with lawyer Morales read, in the version I kept under the notary's hand, 50% to Lucia for her education and to support women's entrepreneurship programs she would help administer, 20% to a local seniors refuge I had supported for years, 10% split between Juana and Mercedes, with the rest, 20%, allocated to small grants for women who wanted to start businesses in neighborhoods like Coyoacán. The specifics were important to me because they stated my values plainly: to protect youth, to honor loyalty, and to ensure that older women would have a place of safety. I did not write those percentages in anger, I wrote them in gratitude. There are moments when you plan something like this when a strange calm floods you. That night, as I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and looked at the list of recordings, I felt like the woman I had always been, deliberate, practical, and oddly hopeful. This was not revenge, it was a restoration. Christmas Eve arrived with the usual chaos: cousins arriving with bottles and pies, the smell of the kitchen like a memory, children's laughter ricocheting against the tiled floors. Vanessa moved through the room like a queen accustomed to courtiers. She wore a new coat, one that made her look larger than she was. Rodrigo stood near her, an unsure statue of a man who had been coaxed into a role. I sat at the head of the table because, despite everything, this was my house. I had 2 napkins neatly folded in front of me and a cup of ponche that had cooled to the precise temperature I prefer. I could have spoken then and there, told everyone what I knew, but the plan was not me. The plan had a righteousness to it that required me to be patient. When Vanessa made the remark, when she said the words that had lodged into the woodwork of the house, there was that sharpened, terrible sound of laughter.
For a moment, the room was a live organism, breathing in surprise. I could see Patricia's fingers tighten around her fork. For a moment, I considered standing and walking out, but then I remembered the years of folds in my chest and decided instead to let the slow mechanism we had built do what we had planned. I reached for the remote and pressed it. The TV came alive. Static. A recorded hallway, an offhand conversation. Vanessa saying, "We can fix this, just sign." The air in the room shifted. Chairs slid. Glass clinked. I watched the faces around me turn from amusement to confusion, the way people turn a page they did not know existed. But then, because this is only part of the story, I will stop here for a moment. The TV was on. The footage was playing. The house waited like an animal that senses rain. I felt my heart move in a careful rhythm, one that said, whatever comes next will not be about proving you wrong or making a spectacle. It will be about truth, in as quiet and forceful a fashion as justice allows. If you have been where I have been, if someone has ever tried to make you small at a table full of people, know this: being patient is not always weakness. Sometimes it is the form courage takes after a lifetime of being underestimated. And sometimes patience is a way to set a very clear table for truth. There is more to tell. The way the videos unfolded, the notary standing and speaking, Lawyer Morales making a simple, blunt announcement, the way people moved in the room like marionettes whose strings had been cut. There is the story of a few nights of sleeping in a different place, of the first meeting with the judge, of the slow, bureaucratic steps that felt like the turning of a great millstone. There is the messy business of family, of gridlocked, tender moments with Rodrigo, of Patricia's tears, of Lucia's fierce, bright courage. But for now, in this place where the television's glow made faces look like windows into other people's weather, I breathe and hold the moment like something fragile and necessary. When the footage ended, when the room settled into a breathless hush, the weight of what we had chosen to do became real. The game had begun to change its rules. I do not want to make a spectacle of other people's suffering. I only want to say that I had reached a point where hiding was a betrayal of myself. The house had been my life. It would not be given away by anyone else's pretty words. Before I go on, I will ask you to leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if you've ever had to stand up for yourself in front of people who think your voice should be quiet. This story is not only mine. It is a story about public shame and private justice, about how dignity can be restored when patience is combined with careful action. That night, after the television went dark for a while and the room hummed with questions, someone murmured a name, Don Julian, and then another, quieter and sharper, legal.
People shuffled. Some looked away. Some looked at Vanessa. A few people reached for their phones. The dinner, which had begun with tamales and laughter, became a courtroom of gazes. I had planned for legal steps, but I had not planned, and never could plan, the many small human fractures that follow public exposure. Rodrigo's face, so like mine, blanched in a way that made me think of my own father looking at a lost flock of sheep. Patricia pressed her napkin to her lips as if to quiet a sob. Juana stood behind me like a rock. Mercedes' hand squeezed mine with a firmness that said more than the words could. We had rehearsed nothing about apologies. People do not control where their hearts go. I had not wanted apology as currency. I had wanted truth and the protection of the things I had built. The night was young, and the consequences of our small, just plan would move slowly through the days to come. But in that moment, as the room waited for me to speak, with the loudness of the television still ringing in our ears, I felt something settle over me like a shawl that had been warmed in the sun, a clarity that comes from being seen. It was not triumph, it was recognition of my life, my struggles, my careful hands. And of course, it would demand steps that would hurt people I loved. That was the terrible, practical cost of choosing dignity over silence. When the television went dark and the room sat like a held breath, someone, Don Julian, I think, stood up. He walked to the center of the gathering with a slow step, the kind that a lifetime of notary work gives you, certain and deliberate. He did not raise his voice. He unfolded a sheet of paper and read, in a voice like a scale being set, what the recording showed and what the documents under my sink had always proved. There was no flourish, just the kind of plain truth that has the weight of ink and seal behind it. These are not accusations without basis, he said. There are recordings, witness statements, and deeds consistent with Miss Amelia's ownership. We have notified institutions of irregular attempts to move property. Pending a formal procedure, we have sought provisional protection to prevent transfers. He used the legal phrase with the same calm he would use when sealing a deed. People listened because the room prefers language that is scheduled and tidy. Lawyer Morales followed. He did not shout. Lawyers who have done this work enough know that a loud voice makes people forget the facts. A measured one makes them listen to what cannot be imagined away. He explained in very plain terms what we had already set in motion. A request had been submitted to a judge to freeze any transfers that could endanger my property. A criminal complaint for fraud had been filed. On the basis of the recorded evidence, the notary's testimony, and the witness accounts. And eviction procedures could be initiated if there was proof of unauthorized occupation or improper claims. That was all business.
It sounded like a clock being wound. It sounded like the world returning to the kind of order that records and rules are meant to bring. The sound of it collapsed the last of the laughter into a different noise. This time not amusement, but the kind of awkward hush you get when an entire room realizes they had been witnessing a different story than they believed. Vanessa stood to object. Her face had the pale heat of someone who had been expecting applause and received a ledger instead. She spun a version of events that had been rehearsed in her head. Misunderstandings, youthful mistakes, a plan gone unnecessarily far. She spoke fast and sharp and tried at one point to seize the remote. A cousin who had been sipping something near the couch stood up and put a hand between her and the television without drama. It was a small gesture that felt monumental. "You're making a mistake," Vanessa said, voice thinner than I had heard when she had been mocking me. "This is private. This is family." "Family," I said, then because it seemed that the word needed retaking. "Family is the thing you protect. That is what this is about." My voice did not tremble. It did not need to. There were 5 people in the room whose lives had been quietly documented by deeds in a box and by the stubborn, ordinary work that had paid for them. I looked at Rodrigo then. His face had gone the color of paper left in the sun. He mouthed something that might have been an apology or a plea. In the end, he sat down, unable to fashion either courage or argument. There was a moment, thin and bright, when the choice everyone was being asked to make showed itself. Some relatives averted their eyes. Others murmured quick defenses for Vanessa that ironically sounded like small petitions for the old order of things. Patricia stood silently, her face wet and small, not from theatricality, but from an actual fracture made visible. Juana and Mercedes stood closer to me than they had before, as if to take some pressure from the air. We did not humiliate. We did not throw words like stones. We presented what had been done. Don Julian read a short statement explaining that he had verified the deeds and that the signatures had been consistent with prior filings. He declared in his professional manner that there were pending legal motions to prevent harm. Lawyer Morales announced that police had been given a copy of the complaint, that the judge had been notified of the provisional measures requested, and that banks were on notice not to process suspicious transfers. The words sounded like locks being turned in many doors at once. There was an arrival of people. Some left immediately, not wanting to watch the rest. Others stayed, as if drawn by the force of a story unfolding. Vanessa's voice rose, and then dropped, and rose again. At one point she laughed in a way that was forced and terrible. The emotional weather in the room scattered, and then congealed into a kind of slow gravity.
That night, in the space that remained after the guests had trickled away, some with side conversations and uneasy glances, others in tears, There were a few necessary, private conversations. Rodrigo came to sit beside me in the kitchen, where the smell of cinnamon and orange lingered like a familiar garment. He did not ask for money. He did not speak of property. He spoke with a kind of rawness that had become a new thing on him. "I'm sorry," he said, in a voice that sounded like someone who had been rehearsing the line and had never found a way to make the words fit. "I didn't understand what was happening. I thought—" "You thought someone you loved would not try to take your home?" I asked him. He could not look at me then. "I loved her," he said, as if the confession explained everything. He spoke of pressure, of friends with advice, of small debts and the easy charm of an idea that looked like rescue. He did not make excuses so much as explain a chain of decisions that had loosened their own ends. I listened. Listening is its own form of action. It did not absolve him. It did not restore trust automatically, but it allowed me to see that betrayal sometimes looks like confusion and ambition braided together. Even betrayal draws from the same cloth of human need. In the days that followed, the legal machinery turned in the patient way that it does. Papers were filed, banks were notified, there were telephone calls with official tones. A judge granted provisional protection, an order that froze transfers and placed the deeds under official review. The word freeze has a small violence to it. It stops the flow of things suddenly and without beauty, but it is a necessary kindness when the intention is to prevent robbery. The complaint filed by lawyer Morales moved into police hands. Officers came to take statements. They were professional and quiet, asking about dates and documents and about what was recorded. They took photographs of the pages I had kept in that wooden box and wrote down the names of those present during certain conversations. Vanessa, in the weeks that followed, moved between outrage and a legal defense that wore the patina of formal strategy. She denied malicious intent and accused me of entrapment, which was not a path the record would support. The recordings we had were not scripts. They were ordinary conversations captured when Vanessa chose to make her intentions clear. There was no stagecraft, only the steady reveal of pattern. As reported, criminal charges proceeded. As reported, Vanessa was later convicted. But that sequence is a formal one, and the courts themselves set the rhythms of sentencing and appeal. I will not speculate on lengths or conditions. Those are matters the courts recorded in their own time. What I can say is that the provisional measures held long enough for the judicial process to begin, and that our immediate objective, the protection of my property, was achieved.
Eviction followed a different tempo. It is one thing to tell a story with words. It is another to remove a person from rooms where they once slept. That removal happened not with showy force, but with the slow deployment of legal authority. Notices, court orders, and finally, a formal procedure executed by a neutral authority. When Vanessa left the house that had been, for a time, indistinguishable from my life, it felt less like triumph than like an old wound finally being sutured. Losing a home is painful in ways that do not correspond neatly to guilt. People who have caused harm are still people, and eviction does not make their humanity or their regret evaporate. Rodrigo's life after those weeks did not snap neatly into place. He lost friends, some of whom had been drawn more to ease than to loyalty. He lost a marriage that had been based on complicated exchanges. He found, too, a weight of responsibility that he had not been ready to carry. He sought to reconcile in ways that were clumsy and honest, visits with careful distance, messages apologetic and sometimes contrite, a handful of attempts to make restitution where he could. I met some of them. I refused others. There is a boundary between justice and reconciliation, and I learned to hold it firmly. Forgiveness is not an obligation. It is a choice I may make on conditions that protect me and honor the truth. There were days after the public part of the story had been told when I was acutely aware of how ordinary the legal steps felt. It was paperwork, appointments, phone calls with lawyer Morales, and the slow grind of bureaucracy. There were moments of fear, of documents delayed, of banks requesting more proof, of unexpected testimony from relatives who did not want to be hauled into the glare. There were also moments of immense relief when a judge signed an order that prevented a transfer, or when a bank relented and froze an account in the interest of fairness. People who read a story like this often imagine a single dramatic event followed by a perfect resolution. It was not like that. There were hearings where we had to show the chain of custody for a recording, where a judge asked whether the devices had been obtained lawfully. Our answers were careful. They were used to protect a vulnerable person, were installed in rooms where conversations routinely took place, and were not intended to provoke illegal acts. The court considered those facts and ruled in favor of provisional protections. Each legal phrase translated into a small, practical safeguard: a hold on an account, a name removed from a title temporarily, confirmation of ownership. In a courtroom one gray morning, I sat with Lucia and watched as evidence was shown and cross-examination was conducted. It is a humbling place, a room where the language of law makes intimate harm into traceable elements.
I felt fierce gratitude for those who did the work. Lawyer Morales with his steady files, Don Julian with his patience in his old-fashioned respect for ink, Juana and Mercedes, who gave statements about what they had seen. Those names mattered. They turned a private fear into a public record. Months passed. Vanessa's legal journey ended, as reported, with a conviction, documented in the public record. I will not claim to be the cause of every judicial move. The courts did what courts do. They reviewed evidence, heard testimony, and made determinations. A conviction does not erase the damage done, but it does record that a state considered the facts worthy of sanction. People in the neighborhood spoke about it in small, unlikely ways. Some said it was a shame. Some said that justice had finally been served. I lived through both responses without needing either to define me. When the legal dust settled enough for me to breathe, I made a decision that surprised some people. I sold the big house. It had been my life for decades. The rooms where I had mended shirts for neighbors, the back patio where Juana taught me how to water the herb pots, the kitchen where tamales had been shaped with love and hands that now shook a little with age. Selling it was like choosing a new garment. It fit differently, but it suited me. The sale was practical. The house was large, required upkeep, and the world was moving around me with a speed I no longer wished to chase. The money from the sale became, in my hands, a tool to make visible the values I had long held quietly. I executed the will I had written earlier with a calm that felt like a final, deliberate stitch. The distribution was clear: 50% to Lucia, who I trusted to continue work in education and to help administer a fund for women's entrepreneurship programs in neighborhoods like Coyoacan. 20% designated for a local seniors refuge that had sheltered many women I knew in times of illness. 10% split between Juana and Mercedes as gratitude for decades of care, and 20% allocated to small grants for women starting businesses, mothers and workers who needed seed money and a vote of confidence. Those numbers were not punishments. They were an expression of my priorities. I remember reading those lines out loud to a small group: Don Julian, Lawyer Morales, Lucia, Juana, and Mercedes, before the will was notarized. I watched their faces as the distribution landed. There was relief, and there was a kind of joy that had nothing to do with spite. It was the quiet satisfaction of a life arranged according to values that matched my years of work and my ideas about fairness. The money did not become trophies. Lucia used her half in ways that made me proud: scholarships for young women to study trades, small loans to women who wanted to open food stalls or repair shops, microgrants for artisans.
The Seniors Refuge received its funds and was able to refurbish beds and improve medical care. Juana and Mercedes bought small things: a new set of pans, a shoulder bag that Juana wanted for long walks. The grants seeded several small ventures: a bakery run by a woman who had once sold tamales on the corner, and a cooperative of seamstresses who made aprons and embroidered table linens that sold well at a Sunday market. Each small business was more than profit. It was dignity turned into livelihood. I moved into a smaller apartment, not far from Coyoacan, a place with a balcony that looks down on a quiet street where children still play, and a man sells churros on Saturdays. There is a little room with a table for writing and a space by the window where I paint. I had never thought of myself as an artist, but there are colors that long had been waiting in my head. At first, the painting was a way to hold the hands that had been busy for decades. Then it became a small, fierce joy. I painted markets and the backs of old women selling chilacas, the way light lands on a mole pot at dusk, and simple still lifes of my cup of coffee and a napkin. People started buying the paintings at small exhibitions organized by Lucia's friends, and the money from the sales, modest, honest, went into the grant fund. Sometimes I teach now, not in a classroom with a syllabus, but in a room at the Women's Center where I talk about being careful and practical, about the importance of deeds and the old trick of keeping a list and remembering where you put your papers. I do not teach surveillance tricks or legal shortcuts. I teach how the small practices of life, counting coins, keeping receipts, naming things you own, can be the scaffolding of autonomy. Women come and tell their stories, a neighbor who took advantage, a son who thought he could borrow indefinitely, a cousin who always smiled while pocketing favors. We make lists together. We laugh. We cry. We plan. Lucia has been remarkable in every way I hoped she could be, and a few I did not expect. She administers the entrepreneurship fund with the steady, patient manners of someone trained in social work and schooled in the difficulties of the world. She sees in each small business not just profit, but the return of a person's sense of self. Watching her is like watching a tree you planted grow taller than you imagined. Rodrigo and I, our relationship found a new form. He came by sometimes with awkward offers that were more about restitution than about regaining lost privileges. He replaced a broken shutter ruts and painted a fence. He read a book once to Lucia's class about responsibility and made the children laugh. Those gestures did not unwrite the past, but they were a tender, practical attempt to take part in a different future. He asked me for forgiveness. I gave it little by little, on terms that kept me safe. Boundaries were part of the language we both learned. It was not charity. It was wisdom.
There were evenings when the city felt small and kind, and others when the echo of those laughing faces at that first dinner returned to haunt me. Memory is like that, sometimes a curtain that moves, and sometimes a draft under a door. When the memory came, I set it down and picked up the brush. When the day felt too heavy, I visited the seniors' refuge and sat with women who told me, in small voices, about their own reclaimings. Those conversations were my greatest consolation. I had not intended to become a symbol, but sometimes the quiet acts of protecting oneself inspire more than loud proclamations. A few months after the legal process started to make its slow decrees, there was a small ceremony for the entrepreneurship grants. Women who had opened businesses, vendors of tostadas, a seamstress, a woman who mended shoes, stood in a little courtyard and shared their stories. Lucia and I listened, and then I was asked to say a few words. I spoke not about vengeance, but about the dignity of being able to make one's own living. I spoke, perhaps with more tenderness than daring, about how secrecy had been a test that exposed the heart of who we are when we are difficult to move. "Keep your papers," I joked to the crowd, and they laughed. But there was more to it than that. There was the idea that small actions, working overtime, saving pesos, keeping a deed under the sink, build a life that cannot be stolen by loud words roan. Those are not dramatic truths, they are practical ones. There were occasions when people asked me if I regretted choosing to expose what had been done. The question was generous and surgical. "I regret," I said, "the way lives were fractured. I regret the hurt this caused my son and his relationships. I do not regret choosing to protect what I had earned and to ensure a future for those who are not in the position to protect themselves. There is an ethics in secrecy when it defends those who are vulnerable, and in transparency when it prevents theft. It is not a simple moral equation, but it is how I chose to live the rest of my days." Vanessa's conviction, when it came, did not feel like a private banquet. It felt like an official recognition that what had been attempted was wrong, and that there are legal consequences for systematic deceit. The formal record is the state's record. I will not celebrate its details. I will say simply that the law acknowledged the patterns we had documented. Life continued, with its small cycles. I took up yoga once, gentle stretches in the morning with a neighbor, so my knees would stop objecting to walking down the steep streets of Coyoacán. I learned how to use my smartphone a little more deftly, mostly to video calls with Lucia when she traveled for work. I joined a small group of women who met every Thursday to discuss books and politics, to talk about chickens and pensions, to knit and then sell the results at the market for charity. The chosen family I built was not a replacement for the one I had been born into. It was a complement. It was people who had seen me and chosen to stand with me. There are days I think of younger women who might read this story and think it a manual for suspicion. It is not. It is a story of a life lived practical and stubborn, of a woman who refused to be erased by people who thought charm could stand for virtue. It is also a story about how love can become dangerous when mixed with impatience and greed, and how a measured response can sometimes be the only moral step left. When the anniversary of that Christmas came, Lucia asked if we would make tamales and invite a few people, neighbors, women from the entrepreneurship program, Juana and Mercedes, to join us. We set a small table, nothing like the dinner that had once been the stage for humiliation, but plenty enough to make a circle warm. We toasted with cups of ponche and spoke about the small projects that were succeeding, a bakery that finally bought a proper oven, a seamstress who had hired an apprentice, an elderly woman who had been given a place in the refuge. We talked, we sang, and we remembered the many women who had taught us to tend our lives from the margins. Before we ate, I raised my cup and said quietly, "To seeing clearly." It was not a triumphant shout. It was a small salute to the practice of paying attention long enough to know when action is necessary. People clinked cups, and for a moment the chaos of life narrowed into a bright thread of gratitude. If you asked me what this story taught me, at the end, what the wrinkle of these years had settled into, I would say this: dignity is not given by applause. It is not restored by social verdicts alone. It is practiced in the small things, keeping receipts, saying no when no is needed, writing a will that names those you wish to protect, making a choice to live in ways that make you recognizable to yourself. There is courage in the absence of spectacle. There is stubbornness in the slow accumulation of evidence and the patient call to law. There is love in making sure the next generation has a chance to build without being preyed upon. On a quiet afternoon, with paint drying beside me and Lucia at the table balancing grant paperwork with a cup of tea, Rodrigo came by with a small pot of plants for the balcony. He did not ask to come in. He handed me the pot and said simply, "I am trying." It was not a demand for absolution. It was a note in the slow music of life. I hugged him. We stood on the threshold for a moment as two people who had walked the same house in different seasons. This story is not a how-to. It is a memory. It is for the women who cook for others and save with a stubborn hand, for the granddaughters who watch and then act with fierce intelligence, and for the men who find themselves having to choose what kind of loyalty they will offer.
It is for anyone who has been made small at a table and wondered whether to speak or to remain quiet. I will leave you with an image: a balcony in Coyoacan, paper lanterns strung above a small table, a cup of coffee steaming, and a painting drying in the sun. Around the table are women who laugh and argue about recipes and politics, who trade pieces of knowledge and small favors. There is a cushion that Juana likes and a plant that Rodrigo brought. The house I sold is gone, but the life I built, the careful ledger of love and labor, lives on in people who now have kitchens of their own, and in small loans that became businesses, and in a refuge where older women sleep without fear. For those who have listened, for those who have been patient, for those who held me when I needed it, thank you.